EPA, in conjunction with state, tribe, and local air monitoring partners and the U.S. Forest Service, enhanced the AirNow Fire and Smoke map by adding PurpleAir sensor data from both permanent and temporary air monitors that was already in the map. But in preparation for the 2021 fire season, several enhancements are going to be made to extend the correction equation that's used to improve sensor accuracy under dense smoke conditions and also adding improved usability features. So this webinar will briefly introduce the map and some of the anticipated new features for 2021, and then follow on with the discussion of why the extended sensor data correction was needed and how it was developed. And so today we have 5 speakers who will be providing this webinar, starting with Ron Evans from EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, and then Ron will turn it over to Sim Larkin from the U.S. Forest Service, who will then turn it to 3 of the scientists in our center, Andrea Clements, Amra Holder, and Caroline Bartjohn. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron to kick off the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. If we could have the next slide, please. I just want to emphasize one thing that Tim said in terms of this being a partnership. It's EPA and the U.S. Forest Service have put a lot of work here to develop something that we hope is very useful to the public to understand their air quality, and working closely with our state, local, and tribal air quality partners. We developed something that was released last year, and I'll go over a little bit of the details on that, but we found that it was an excellent source of information for the public at large during a particularly significant fire season last year. And so what I want to do is just briefly go through this presentation outline and then give you some background before I turn it over to Sim, who's going to talk about some of the updates. So as Tim just indicated, the first step is putting on a sensor data layer to the AirNow Fire and Smoke map. And I'll go through that history a little bit and then talk about the planned updates for that, as Sim will take care of that. And then we'll move on into these remaining sections, which will be covered by our Office of Research and Development partners here on the background of air sensors, really the heart of this webinar, talking about updating the U.S. Wide Correction for PurpleAir sensors. And then the researchers will cover a little bit of FAQs. We'll talk about some take-home messages from this webinar, and then at the very end, you'll have some resources that are pointed out in the last couple pages in terms of websites, as well as our emails if you want to get in touch with any of the presenters here. So if I could have the next page. What I'm planning to do here is just give you a little bit of history and background on the AirNow Fire and Smoke map itself. If I could have the next slide. Prior to last year, there was a fire and smoke map on airnow.gov, which gave information on air quality information on fire and smoke episodes. And that map was based on the regulatory and temporary monitors, along with some smoke plumes and fire locations. They provided a very good set of data, but it's limited in some ways because regulatory monitors are not everywhere and temporary monitors show up during the course of fires. But again, the areas to be covered are very extensive. And so our partnership decided that it would be very helpful if we could start taking advantage of new technologies and taking advantages of some working relationships that our Office of Research and Development has with the PurpleAir company. We added the publicly available PM2.5 data from PurpleAir sensors, and that was released in August of 2020. The next slide, please. The pilot that we used last year had 2 primary goals. One is to go ahead and provide additional air quality information to the public to protect their health during fire and smoke events. Again, what that's doing is increasing the density of the number of mechanisms to collect air quality information in addition to the regulatory monitors. But also, in addition to increasing that density, it's also providing a lot more coverage where permanent monitors and temporary monitors don't exist. So in the West, with the particularly large distances between cities and things, you might find that there's a permanent monitor in one city that's a distance of maybe 40 to 80 miles from another, and adding in the PurpleAir sensors, there's another maybe 10, 15 data points that may appear between those cities. So it's not only is it providing additional information during the fire and smoke events, but it's also giving people who don't live close by to a permanent marker or monitor some information about air quality in their area, even in the absence of these fire and smoke events. If I could have the next page. So, as I indicated in terms of the goals, we wanted to use this pilot to go ahead and give the public the ability to see the air quality information from the permanent monitors and the sensors. But I think the real critical thing that we provide here is that we're providing this information on an apples to apples basis. And that's sort of the heart of the use of the correction equation that will be talked on later. It's important for the public to see this information in a consistent and comparable fashion, and to do that in a scientifically credible way. And so what remains on this page is just giving you some ideas of why we believe that's important, and what the true innovation, if you will, is of the use of this AirNow Fire and Smoke map. Technology is advancing very rapidly, and we're seeing a lot of sensors come online and providing the public with potentially conflicting information and leading to some confusion. And what we're also seeing with this addition of sensors coming on the line, they display the information differently, different time scales, compared to the historical AirNow and other state websites. And the other part of this is that some of these private sector air quality sites are also putting together their own different kinds of air quality indexes. So again, is another mismatch here of the information that the public may see. And so again, just to reemphasize, one of the true innovations here of this information is that the public can directly compare that data, that information that they see from the permanent monitors to the PurpleAir sensors on a single map. If I could have the next slide. I think that most everybody knows that last year was one of the worst fire seasons in U.S. history. And so the timing of this release was particularly fortuitous to be able to get additional information out to the public. And if I could have the next slide. The evidence we have of this is that over the first 3 months, which covered most of the fire season in the fall of 2020, there were nearly 7.5 million page views of the map. And there's a lot of repeats and things like that, but it's just an incredible amount of activity for a website that didn't previously really exist. And so it hit very nicely with a rather drier situation of the fire season. And we heard a lot of very positive comments, and you can see a couple here. One from a government agency talking about the addition of this information being very useful, but also you have, we saw several comments from the public saying how much the information and the addition of the sensors really made a difference to their individual decisions on what they would do during a wildfire, and providing them additional information that they could use. So if I could have the next slide. So with the next fire season coming upon us, we're planning to work on upgrades that Sim is going to go over in just a moment. And we are using a process which updates the map fairly frequently. And so you would see right now, if you compare the map from August 2020 to that now, there's things we've done already to make things more useful. But we do plan in July of 2021 to provide an additional set of upgrades, which we believe is going to make the public's access and usability of the information that much better. And we do want to emphasize that this will remain as a pilot. And it's not something that we traditionally talk a pilot may disappear someday. It's not that kind of pilot. What we're doing is trying things out. Typically, you find with a government website, it becomes static and is updated on a less frequent data basis. And so as a pilot, we're able to go ahead and try different things out. And if we find that certain kinds of information isn't serving the public well, we can adjust it to something else. And so that's the process we've been using over the last year to continually upgrade the information to help the public get better information along the way. Now, as we're going to get ready and release this in July, we're sitting down with our state and tribal and local partners, as well as EPA regional staff, on the changes, because they're the people on the ground that are working with the public and other officials to understand what's there and give us best guidance they can on how we're doing in terms of improving what we're putting together. So if I could have the next page. So this is a general set of our next steps and what we're thinking about, because anytime you put out a website, you do see that you get very good comments on how we could do things better. And so what you're seeing here on this page is just a high level summary of the kinds of things that we're doing to make things better. You'll hear Sim talk about improving the functionality, making it easier to navigate, and creating a better user experience for mobile users. In that particular case, while Sim is improving the website, we're also going to enhance the AirNow app to have a direct link to the fire and smoke map. We're also going to go ahead and clarify to the best we can some of the differences that people point out in terms of things that didn't quite make sense to the public as they looked at the fire and smoke map versus the AirNow webpage versus the information that appears on the PurpleAir website. And then finally here at the bottom, we're adding information there that hopefully is more usable in terms of actions people can take care of, they can take care to protect themselves. And then what we're also trying to do is make the information a little more timely by telling people what the more recent information from the sensors is showing in terms of the trends. And now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sim Larkin from the U.S. Forest Service.
Thank you, Ron. Hi, I'm Sim Larkin. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service, and I just want to thank the organizers and for allowing me this opportunity to talk to you today a little bit about some of the updates that we're excited to do for this year's fire and smoke map. Next slide, please. So the fire and smoke map, as it was introduced last year, had a number of different layers on it, as Ron alluded to, and came in a mode that was available both on desktop and on mobile. It contained permanent monitoring sites, temporary monitoring sites, as well as the low-cost sensor layer that we're going to be discussing at length later in this seminar. It also contains several layers dealing with fire information and smoke plumes. And so all of those things were sort of put together, and there were other functionalities added in, like trying to do geolocation, trying to provide the user with some information in their area, etc. All of that is continuing this year, but there are specific updates that we're trying to do to make everything easier to navigate and just a better experience. Next slide, please. So there are many changes going on, and not all of them will be directly visible to the user. Some of the specific changes that are going on are the updated correction factor. That's the focus of this seminar, so I'm not going to discuss that here. But there's a lot of work that's gone on in the background of the map to try and lower the barrier to entry, so to make it work more smoothly and faster in places with low bandwidth or with perhaps slightly older equipment, so that more people can have easier access to it. We want to enhance the mobile experience generally, and because a lot of the users for the map are using mobile devices, and so we want to take advantage of that and sort of provide a tailored functionality even more than we did last year. And then there are some additional feature sets that we're trying to put in. So all of this is a lot of work, and hopefully it just comes out as a generally better experience for the user. Next slide, please. One of the things that you'll notice pretty immediately is that there's just a lot more PurpleAir sensors on the map. These low-cost sensors that we're using from PurpleAir, there's a lot more of them installed, even compared with the end of the summer in 2020. And so that provides even better spatial coverage, more locations, sensors in places where we didn't previously have any data. Next slide, please. Another thing that we're really focused on is just trying to make the map more accessible and easier to understand. We've moved the map legend so that it is right there and easier to get to, more visible, and hopefully helps better explain the map, but can also be kind of tucked away out of the way so it's not occupying your screen real estate when you don't want it to be. We're creating a whole new batch of FAQs and changing how we're dealing with FAQs and their presentation so that even as we get questions throughout the year, we can add those more easily and try and maintain an updated and improve the language as we get comments back, things like that. Next slide, please. We're also, a lot of work has gone into when you find a sensor or monitor that you are particularly interested in what's going on there, like maybe one that's close to you where you live or where you are currently. How do we present that information to you to try and highlight the things that might be most important to the user right up front? So this system has been completely reworked, and so when you first go into this pop-up on the map, we're trying to present to you not only the current conditions and really highlight what those conditions are. So here you can see a very large solid green bar, as well as the nowcast values. But we're also trying to give you an action message. So in this case, enjoy the fresh air. It's in good conditions. We're trying to allow you quick sort of, like if you're on your mobile device, perhaps quick thumb clicks into more information on each of these things. So clicking on any bit of this will sort of take you to a pane with more information that can help discuss what is happening currently, something which we'll get to in a minute, which is where are things headed, what's the trend, and then of course really highlighting these protective actions that you might want to take. Obviously in good conditions, not a lot to say there, but as we get into the higher concentrations, which we'll be talking about the correction factor for, this becomes ever more important. The specific language and things that you'll be seeing over the next few slides here are still going to be revamped and tested out and discussed with our partners. And so you may see some tweaks before all of this really comes out in July, but hopefully this gives you a sense of where we're headed. Next slide, please. So one of the things we want to do is we want to provide the data in a variety of ways. So not everybody picks up on data exactly the same way. So one of the nice things that the AirNow main site uses is a gauge to show you sort of where you are in the realm of the nowcast. And so we are trying to adapt the specific look and feel of that AirNow gauge and bring it into the fire and smoke map. Right, next slide. We also want to take advantage, and this is sort of a new area for us, we want to take advantage of the fact that these low-cost sensors that we're incorporating report back very quickly compared to a lot of permanent or temporary monitoring sites. And they report back sort of shorter-term averages, which can be quite interesting. Now, these shorter-term averages have less established connections with you know, the sort of health messaging and other sort of established ways of communicating what's going on, but they do provide a little bit of a snapshot of where things are headed. And so there's a bunch of work that's happening trying to investigate how do we use this short-term recent conditions to try and give you a sense of where things are headed without diminishing from the main message, which is that what the overall nowcast conditions are. So that nowcast has a lot of history and a lot of importance. We're retaining that, but we're adding in this new idea, and we're calling that trending. So this use of the shorter term data is really designed to give you a sense of how things are trending, even you know, more recently than that longer term nowcast average represents. Next slide, please. So just an example of how that is going to look. So, you know, if you see trending here, we have sort of an arrow going up inside of a red circle. And then there's a message that, you know, the more recent measurements from the nearby this monitor have increased into the sort of red or unhealthy range of the AQI. It doesn't mean that we're actually in the unhealthy range, it just means that we're headed that way if things were to continue. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense to the user of where we're going with, you know, or where the air quality in that region is headed and might be sort of in a more recent measurement. So when things evolve quickly, it can be responsive. And obviously these messages will get sort of hashed out as we get feedback from users and figure out how to get that message across in the best possible way. Next slide. One of the things we've done actually already is we've connected the to a very large source of fire information, a management source from the wildfire suppression side, management side, called InsaWeb. If you're not familiar with it, it's maintained by the National Interagency Fire Center, and it contains information about all of the major fire incidents that are going on, and includes a lot of details about what the management of that incident is doing, how the fire's been progressing, etc. And so we're now directly linking when you see a fire on the fire and smoke map and you click on it, you can get to the information about that specific fire within InsaWeb. So hopefully that's a useful feature for people. Next slide. And there is, of course, ongoing work on how we can incorporate other types of air sensors, other types of low-cost sensors. And so this is being done in stages where we're trying to establish standards to be able to, you know, incorporate those with the same sort of clarity and reliability that the work on PurpleAir has allowed us to do for those low-cost sensors. And to, you know, open that up over time. Now, unfortunately, this is not likely to happen in time for the start of the 2021 Western wildfire season. And of course, any decision on this is going to have to be done in, with consultation and agreement by all the partners involved, including the state, local, tribal, and agencies. So, this is an evolving effort, but it is on our minds to how we bring in even more low-cost sensor data. And thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea.
Thanks, Sam. So now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about air sensors and the air sensor data that's flowing to the fire and smoke map. Next slide. So first, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page in understanding that air sensors are a relatively new technology. And that means that the performance, especially related to the permanent monitors, is largely unknown. So how do we try to determine how sensors are performing? Well, namely, we run co-locations, and that means that we're running air sensors co-located or running side by side with permanent or temporary monitors. And these are our trusted methods. And so from that type of analysis, we can understand how sensors compare, if there are systematic biases or if environmental conditions are impacting those sensors. And our research has really shown that air sensors do have systematic biases, which means sometimes they can over or under predict the actual pollutant concentration relative to a reference monitor. And oftentimes they're influenced by meteorology because they don't have the same temperature or relative humidity controls that the permanent monitors have. But we've learned that we can also improve the performance of an air sensor by building a correction or a mathematical adjustment for the data to make it more comparable to the permanent monitors. Next slide. So in the case of the PurpleAir data that's flowing to the fire and smoke map, we've done a number of these co-locations across the United States. Some of them have been done by EPA, but many of them have been done by our state, local, and tribal air monitoring partners, and we really thank them for that work. This data was collected to understand how the sensors perform under typical ambient concentrations, but also during smoke impacted times where those pollutant concentrations can be much higher. And through this work in 2019, we developed a U.S. Wide Correction equation for the PM2.5 data coming from PurpleAir sensors. And this is the correction that has been applied to all of the data that's flowing to the AirNow Fire and Smoke map. Additionally, we developed a number of data cleaning steps based on the two independent measurements of PM within this sensor. So those two blue boxes are two different sensors, which we call channels A and B. And when the channels match, we have reasonable confidence that the sensor is performing well and that the data is good. And when they're not agreeing very well, we have a reasonable expectation that something may be wrong. And we may flag and remove that data until it gets better. And next, I would like to pass it on to Caroline Barkjohn, who's going to talk more about evaluating the U.S. Wide Correction in light of data collected during the 2020 wildfire season.
Thanks, Andrea. So as Andrea said, we started with this U.S. Wide Correction in 2019, where we built and tested our correction based on 24-hour average data from federal reference and equivalent methods in 16 states. And if you want to read more, you can check out our publication that was recently accepted. And so this correction is a function of the PurpleAir PM2.5 and the relative humidity measured by the PurpleAir. And so after building that correction, we tested it on 1 hour smoke and ambient data sets. Most of the smoke impacted data came from Amher's paper that's linked here. And so we could see that our U.S. Wide Correction, shown in teal here, worked pretty well up to about 250 micrograms per meter cubed. But as many of the previous speakers mentioned, in 2020, we had some extreme smoke impacts on the West Coast. And so you can see this graphic here just showing our previous range was just a very small fraction of this full range we saw in 2020, where some of the co-located data got up to 1,500 micrograms per meter cubed. And so you start to see this strong underestimate where, you know, the PurpleAir is only reading 500 micrograms, even though the monitor is reading 1,000. And so we really need an extended correction in order to get better estimates under these extremely high concentration conditions. And so there's been some past lab studies showing that a polynomial fit may be better at these high concentrations instead of a linear fit like we've done, and that the PurpleAir stops responding about 1,000 or 11,000 to 13,000 micrograms per meter cubed. So we really should be able to capture, you know, up to 1,500 or 2,000, like we were looking at on the previous slide. And so in terms of our requirement, we really want something that is going to fit over the full range. And this is super important because we want the map to be useful both during times of the year with and without smoke impacts. So both at those low concentrations and at the really high concentrations. We want to consider the influence of relative humidity. Like Andrea said, many of the permanent monitors control for relative humidity. They dry the PM2.5, and so since the PurpleAirs, you know, it may be a little bit warmer and drier in there, but they aren't systematically drying the aerosol. And so the PM2.5 may be overestimating, kind of like how you see on this plot, where you see more of the lighter low RH near the bottom. Increasing RH seems to lead to higher PurpleAir response. And lastly, for our correction, we want simple as possible. And so we want the model to be broadly applicable and easy to interpret. And I'd like to hand it over to Amra to talk a little bit about the data set she identified.
Thanks, Caroline. So now that we know that we need a new correction, we need a new data set to build the correction on. And so we monitored the AirNow Fire and Smoke map during these smoke episodes through August through October of 2020 last year to identify sensors that had a monitor pair that was nearby. And were experiencing high concentrations. We found a number of those across the Western United States, but we had to exclude a few of those because of some poor agreement and some outlier points. This is an example of one of the excluded sites here where you could see that the PurpleAir continues to respond to smoke, but the reference monitor starts to decrease in signal, and then eventually goes offline before coming back online, apparently being repaired. So we had a couple of those issues where both the reference and the sensors might have gone down, and so we kicked those out of the data set. Next slide, please. So the final smoke impacted data set spanned a number of locations throughout California, Oregon, and Idaho. So we had a reasonable geographic spread. These were pretty good, solid co-locations where the sensor's right next to the reference. These locations also saw some very high smoke concentrations. So we had a number in Northern California and in the Sierra Nevada range that saw concentrations up to 1,500 microgram per meter cube. The data was obtained from August all the way through October, so we captured a range of temperature and relative humidity conditions during that time span, and then also, we believe we captured a number of different types of fires and phases of the fire, both fresh smoke and aged smoke and smoldering smoke. So we had a pretty good distribution of different conditions. I'll pass it back to Caroline to talk about the correction development.
Thanks, Amra. So in addition to those extremely high concentration data sets, we also included some of the previous co-locations under smoke conditions and also some typical ambient data sets. And so we try to capture a wide range of different states and conditions, and most of these sites are a year or more of hourly data. So this ends up being an extremely large data set when you think about years worth of hourly data. And so when we were thinking about our correction, we considered a variety of terms. We looked at linear, quadratic, and cubic fits, so that would be PurpleAir, PurpleAir squared, and PurpleAir cubed terms. We looked at relative humidity, and we looked at the interaction between relative humidity and PM2.5. So relative humidity times the PurpleAir, or relative humidity times the PurpleAir PM2.5 squared. And then we looked at piecewise fits, where we switched the equation at a specific concentration. But we really wanted to reduce any gaps that may occur. You can see the illustration here just showing, a poorly fitting piecewise fit versus a well-fitting piecewise fit. And we wanted to limit it to two pieces of equation if possible, just for ease of use and interpretability. And so in order to select the best performing model, we wanted to evaluate the performance at each air quality index breakpoint. And so this is super important since the air quality index is the primary way risk is communicated on the map. And so here you see our AQI categories. And so we bin the data based on the breakpoint, plus or minus 20%. So, the breakpoint from good to moderate is 12 micrograms. So, 10 to 14. And we looked all the way up actually to 500 micrograms per meter cubed, which is the California OSHA limit for outdoor workers to put on respirators. And so we wanted to look up till there. And we did also look at the data less than 10 micrograms and greater than 600 micrograms, just to make sure it seemed reasonable, even though we weren't really trying to optimize at those concentration levels. And so we built and tested our model using withholding. So for example, we would build a model based on all of our sites except for Phoenix, and then we would apply it to Phoenix and see how it works, or we would build based on all but one of the smoke impacted sites, and then we would apply it to that one smoke impacted site to see how well it worked. And so this is really important because it gives us a better idea of how the correction may work on sites that are not included in our data set. And it helps us to avoid selecting too complicated of a model that isn't going to work in the real world. And so we wanted to target a bias of less than plus or minus 5% in each bin. So not having a systematic bias where, at the unhealthy breakpoint, everything reads 20% high on average. And then we wanted to reduce the error, kind of the random noise in each bin also. And so this is the equation we came up with, basically using U.S. Wide Correction that we had developed previously, where the PurpleAir is reading less than 343 micrograms per meter cubed, and then switching to a quadratic fit at the higher concentrations. And so this gives us a much better agreement over the full range of concentrations. So I've just pulled an example from Forks of Salmon, and these few days give us a really good example because there's some really low concentrations and some much higher concentrations. And so you see in gray, the old U.S. Wide Correction. In purple, you see the updated extended correction, and then in black, you see the monitor. And so, you're seeing these large underestimates from the gray line, but once we use this updated correction, we can get much better performance. And it's not perfect everywhere, but it's doing a better job. And just a note, other corrections available on PurpleAir.com, they look very similar to the old U.S. Wide Correction, except for the LRAPA correction, which really underestimates above 60 micrograms per meter cubed, since it was only built for 0 to 60. And our equation does have relative humidity in it, which does make it a little bit more applicable to a broad range of locations. And so, like I said, we were evaluating by breakpoint, and so we ended up keeping the bias within 5%, and also the error, that random error, to plus or minus 22% in each bin. So we feel really good about that. And just a note, it's very challenging to truly estimate error on the PurpleAirs because there's some uncertainty even in our reference monitors and our stationary and permanent monitors, especially at these higher time resolutions, 1 hour averages. There may be some distance between the PurpleAirs and the monitors, and there may be some variation in the individual sensors. So I'd like to pass it back to Amara.
Thanks, Caroline. I'll go over some of our frequently asked questions about using sensors on the AirNow Fire and Smoke map. Next slide, please. Number one question we get is, why doesn't my PurpleAir sensor show up on the map? There's a number of different reasons why that may be so, and I'm just going to go through them very quickly here. First one is if your sensor is registered as indoor, it's not going to show up. We only show the outdoor sensors that are public. So it would need to be outdoor and public registered. If you just registered your sensor, it may be too soon to show up on the map. It takes us a little bit of time to process that and get it on the display. So give it about 2 days to let it appear. If you're missing times of data, that will not meet our completeness criteria. So we really like to have about 90% of the hour there, and we need a couple of hours data to compute the nowcast. So if you have some problems with your connectivity and you've got some downtimes on your sensor, you will not show up on the map. If you don't meet our quality control criteria with the channel agreement, your sensor is not going to show up on the map. And finally, any sensors that are flagged as problematic will be manually removed. So this is an example here of a sensor that is not in agreement with its surroundings. So it's showing a much higher temperature than its neighbors. And so this is a sensor that would be flagged and removed because it's not representing ambient conditions there. Next slide, please. Okay, so now you might be asking, well, how do I set up my sensor to represent ambient conditions properly? So we came up with our top 5 siting criteria or considerations, and these are in a prioritized order. So if you can only hit one, start with number 1 and do as many as you can on this list. So the first thing that we recommend is to try and stay away from some of these other PM sources. Especially for the fire and smoke map where we're interested in a ambient concentration, we really don't want to see sensors that are impacted by dusty roads or building exhausts or barbecue grills or fire pits or smokers. So try and get your sensor away from those sorts of sources. You'd also want to set up your sensor so that you have free airflow up to the sensor area. So ideally, this would be as much as 270 degrees free airflow around the sensor, but no less than 180. If you need to set it up against a wall, we understand that. That's not going to be terrible. But you don't want to tuck it behind other pieces of furniture where it can't get at the air. The third consideration is to have it at least 1 meter above ground. Ideally, you'd like to put it where you're breathing. So your breathing zone height would be where you want your sensor to be. 4, you want it to be away from structures, but if you must be near a structure, place it on the upwind side so it's getting a better, more characteristic measurement. And finally, this is sort of your common sense considerations. Put it in a site where you can support it. Make sure that you have pretty good cell signal or Wi-Fi signal there so that you keep your uptime high. Make sure that you've got some reliable power, that it's tamper resistant so it's not going to be stolen, and that it's safe to install. Once you've got your sensor installed, it's a good idea to go back and look at the data and see how well it's performing. Are you seeing some of these spikes that might be indicative of cooking or smoking? Or these spikes have a cyclic nature that might be indicative of an HVAC source impacting you? How do you compare to your neighbors? Do the trends agree? If you find that you have issues with any of those, you might want to change where you've got your sensor located. If you're interested in developing your own correction, we have some information for that on EPA Air Sensor Toolbox. So there's a co-location guide. I recommend you check it out. Next slide, please. Now, we touched on this briefly before, and we've thought a lot about what would be needed to have similar confidence for a different type of sensor, not PurpleAir, for this type of application. When we're thinking about the U.S. wide map, we would want a sensor that would cover the full range of conditions and still provide accurate data. So that would be even typical ambient times when the concentrations are low, as well as smoke impacted times. Ideally, your sensor would perform well all the way up to 600 microgram per meter cube, but at least 300 microgram per meter cube, because this is where people are making decisions on their health protective actions. You'd like to be able to have evaluations for a variety of types of fires. These might be prescribed fires or wildfires or even wood smoke. All of those sources are important. You'd like to have an evaluation that would span a wide range of relative humidities and temperatures and be done in different locations across the country, and preferably for deployments over a long period of time to make sure that your sensor can handle the wear and tear of being up and running for days and months. And finally, it's been really important to have these quality assurance procedures. PurpleAir has these redundant sensors that makes that QA check possible. Without a duplicate sensor on board, it may be very challenging to identify when your sensor has gone bad, but that's really, we found, an important feature. Next slide, please. Okay, so with this, I'll just wrap it up quickly with our take-home messages. The AirNow Fire and Smoke map has proved to be an extremely useful tool, showing these sensors side by side with the monitors all in one place. Everything's been quality assured and corrected for you, and you also have messaging to go along with it. Now, with the extension of the correction, we can provide accurate data all the way up to 1500 microgram per meter cube to give the public even more health protective information. Next slide, please. There is additional resources on EPA Air Sensors Toolbox. This is for sensors, and then on the fire.airnow.gov. And then if you want to get into some of the gory details, please take a look at our publications listed here. Next slide, please. And here's our contact information. We'd be happy to speak with any of you if you have any questions. Of course, there's the Fire and Smoke map contact where most questions can be directed to. And next slide, please. I should mention that this work has been a huge collaboration of people